Greetings, comrades. Hope this finds you well. Quick shout out to the 2 Uber comrades supporting my channel and this content on Patreon. My partner, thank you, and Independent Left News. Definitely check them out. They are a great resource. So, as I was running an errand earlier today, getting some spring water, because it's just, why would you not? If you have access to high quality spring water, why would you not drink that? So, it's a bit of a drive to get to the spot, and as opposed to listening to just the regular bullshit that's on radio, I tuned on the Gray Zone, and Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton were talking about a number of topics. One of those was the supposed whistleblower from Facebook and the testimony that they provided at the US Congress, and I thought their analysis and insight on this topic, and they also later in the podcast got into talking about the Pandora Papers, but I wanted to focus on this Facebook whistleblower discussion that they were having, because I thought it was really frankly very interesting, and you're not obviously not going to get this type of content or analysis from mainstream media. So I thought we would share and listen here. So here we go.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
This is Moderate Rebels Live. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal. Today we're going to talk about big tech, a variety of different issues. In the past few weeks, we've seen several scandals related to Facebook, Google, and called whistleblower from Facebook, which it's quite incredible to see the corporate media embracing a whistleblower.
Yes, as opposed to how they've treated actual whistleblowers that were exposing the crimes of the US empire. Think of Daniel Hale, Julian Assange, who is still languishing away in that high security prison in UK, as the US is still trying to extradite him under the Biden administration. Daniel Hale, who was recently sentenced for exposing some of the crimes of the drone program, the drone assassination program, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, John Kiriakou, etc., right? So I mean, but this Facebook whistleblower is being treated with kid gloves and given all this positive support in the media and the mainstream media by the corporate media. Anytime that's happening, there's probably something nefarious going on behind that, right?
Reminds me of when in the Trump administration there were these so-called whistleblowers. Well, actively, the most famous whistleblower, actual whistleblower on earth, Julian Assange,
languished away in
being
prison
tortured
right
in a high-security
100%.
prison alongside so-called terrorists. So it's very suspicious for me whenever we see mainstream corporate media
100%.
suddenly embrace a whistleblower. It's also reminiscent.
Always appreciate Ben Norton's analysis. He rarely misses, right?
Of a scandal we're going to talk today about, which was, do you all remember Cambridge Analytica? And there was supposedly this whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica. Well, it turns out that much of what he actually said, Christopher Wiley, ended up being totally debunked. And we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about the so-called Facebook whistleblower. And then we're going to talk about the Pandora Papers,
Haugen, right?
And how it seems more and more that U.S. spy agencies, intelligence agencies, spooks and feds that throughout the world for so many years have carried out meddling operations and disinformation campaigns. Increasingly, those campaigns are coming back home. And more we see information war targeting domestic populations. A major Canadian newspaper just acknowledged that the military has been testing its propaganda campaigns, its information warfare techniques against its own domestic population. And increasingly, I think we see very similar campaigns in the United States. And the corporate media is, of course, a handmaiden. CNN is really pushing a lot of this coverage. So, Max,
the CIA News Network.
Let's just begin. I want to talk at the beginning of this stream, because I know people have a lot of questions about this so-called Facebook whistleblower. It's all over the media 24/7 right now.
Haugen,
she just testified in the Congress.
Right?
CNN is doing constant coverage. And
it's very interesting and revealing, some of the testimony that they show later on that this whistleblower provided to Congress, where she's demonizing the usual suspects that the U.S. empire is currently waging, these propaganda, these regime change efforts against. China, Russia. I think she mentions Russia, Iran. Who else? I think there was some more in there, but so it's like there's probably some shady shit going on behind the scenes with this whistleblower.
What is your take on this so-called whistleblower, and why is the media, after constantly demonizing Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, actual whistleblowers, why all this?
Well, obviously because this serves the interests of the corporate state, and what she ends up saying in her testimony, and they share this clip, she thinks that counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, counter-espionage, not counterinsurgency, counter-espionage efforts need to be beefed up, stepped up at Facebook. Who does that benefit? That benefits the U.S. empire, the military-industrial complex, Silicon Valley, all of these companies, right? Surveillance state in general.
All of a sudden, does it care so much about this whistleblower?
Well, first of all, thanks for that excellent intro.
And they're matching.
And also for wearing the same shirt as me in the next live stream. We're both going to be wearing black berets, and we're going to strum folk tunes together. We'll be sitting on stools. And if we're Simon and Garfunkel, I think I'm Garfunkel because I have more male pattern baldness. But
I do appreciate Max Blumenthal's sense of humor and his self-deprecating nature. I do really like that.
But that was a really good lead in to this discussion, and tying the Pandora Papers to the Facebook's quote unquote whistleblower. I mean, who absolutely makes a mockery of whistleblowers. If anyone watched my and Ben's stream about dissidents that are weaponized against official enemies, this whistleblower reminded me a lot of dissidents, particularly the official U.S. cult.
What kind of microphones they're using? They sound really good. Probably not a little higher quality than this one, but this was fairly inexpensive.
Activated dissidents, especially Naira, in the way that she was so prepared and coached by the national security state and had been plucked almost out of nowhere in order to deliver a testimony that dovetailed so closely with the Democrats' censorship agenda that was rolled out, beginning with Hillary Clinton's first public statement after losing to Donald Trump, where she condemned fake news and called for its obliteration through a partnership between the government and big tech. That's obviously what Frances Haugen was carted in to do.
Yeah, she's not Frances Haugen. This Facebook whistleblower isn't going in there saying that, these big tech companies have too much power. We need to nationalize them, treat them as a public utility, similar to a phone company, something like that. She's saying, no, it's just the U.S. government needs more, input. We need more, counter surveillance. We need more counterterrorism resources. So again, she's going in there, and having this, line of thought, this line of reasoning that would give big tech, big government more surveillance power to go after people that criticize, the U.S. empire, that criticize U.S. imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, etc. Right?
And Frances Haugen, go search her on any search engine. Try to find her LinkedIn. It's locked. Her Twitter account is locked.
I'm gonna look that up.
Her Twitter account was immediately verified, which is a telltale sign that big tech has some kind of relationship with the forces that cultivated Haugen. She has almost no background that we can discern. The right wing claims that she was part of the civic responsibility team of Facebook that buried the story about Hunter Biden's laptop and prevented users from sharing the New York Post article about Hunter Biden's laptop at the tail as Biden and Trump entered the finish lane for the 2020 presidential election. It was one of the most overt cases of online censorship in order to tilt the race towards Biden. It was a shocking. I don't know if that's true. I just see it on right-wing sites, so you have to ask questions. But we have to ask questions about who this person is and what her agenda is. And she makes her agenda
her Twitter
fairly clear
only has 5,
in her opening statement, but she's kind of vague about what she wants
only has
to do.
5.
Essentially, she's calling for massive government.
She only has 5 tweets. I just looked at her Facebook, 5 tweets going back to October 3rd. So it seems like this was a very coordinated effort. And like Max Blumenthal said, she has a blue check next to her name, even though she's been on Twitter all of literally 5 freaking tweets. Seems like there's something kind of fishy going on, right?
Oversight of Facebook and Instagram. And she's right that their algorithmic amplification of certain toxic sites is wrong and needs to be reined in.
But
she's also right that Instagram encourages toxic self-images.
But what she's calling for actually won't address any of these issues.
Particularly among young women. I mean, the whole culture of Instagram is absolutely disgusting. There's a reason that China's government has taken action against it because they don't want their society to be completely poisoned. But what is the agenda here? It seems to be much more far-reaching than simply limiting what Frances Haugen called anger-driven virality. And it's just about giving the government more ability to censor the internet as a whole and social media in particular.
And again, that type of censorship, that type of surveillance will always be used against people who call out the U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism, capitalism, in the imperial core, outside of it, which is, imperialism, and, white supremacy, people who are speaking up for, the Palestinians or anybody else under, the boot of oppression, abroad, right?
There's a desire among the our ruling elite now, and particularly those who identify with the left of center and the Democrats, to get rid of Section 230. Section 230 of the U.S. Code that was passed in the Communications Decency Act immunizes social media companies and internet hosting sites from lawsuits related to third-party content. So basically, if Section 230 is removed,
and then somebody could be sued, right?
Then somebody could. I mean, we talked about this on a previous show, Ben and I, about the insane lawsuit that we faced, a phony lawfare attack on us by a wealthy neoconservative heiress. Now, that lawsuit could have potentially been directed against any site, for example, WordPress for hosting us and hosting the Gray Zone, or YouTube for hosting this live stream, if Section 230 were removed. And that would mean that those sites, Facebook, YouTube, which is owned by Google, would begin removing all content that was considered controversial, or open them up for further lawsuits. So they would self-regulate all inconvenient information out, which is actually something they might want to do anyway, because they're trying to get rid of smaller companies.
Yeah.
And there would be this huge boon for online content moderation, which the government would directly participate in. So that's a huge red flag there. And then we see, and we should throw this video up, another telltale sign that Frances Haugen is not a whistleblower, but is actually a kind of, I mean, it might be too extreme to call her an intelligence operative, but she concludes her opening
the bidding of the intelligence, agencies, the intelligence apparatus
statement by mentioning that Myanmar and Ethiopia, which are 2 targets of U.S. empire right now, are just the beginning, and that these countries or their governments are actually using Facebook to target their opposition, U.S.-backed opposition. And then during Q&A, I think with Senator Richard Blumenthal, who is no relation to me, fortunately, and is a huge proponent of online censorship, one of the leading figures pushing for this. She goes.
See what he's talking about. If you look at Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State in the Biden administration, if you look at his Twitter, or you just Google it, it comes up. So today I met with African Union High Representative and IG80 chair and the Ethiopian core group of the EU, UK, France, and Germany ceasefire negotiations, unhindered humanitarian access to all Ethiopians who are suffering are urgently needed. So again, anytime somebody, within the U.S. empire, within this settler colonial government talks about, human rights, democracies, these authoritarian governments, we gotta put our critical thinking cap on and, not just take everything that they're throwing at us, because more than often not, it's obviously going to be bullshit designed, for U.S. geopolitical interest, the interests of the U.S. empire, in this case, in Africa, and trying to counter, China's, influence vis-a-vis things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
In about China, or she levels allegations against China for using Facebook as an information weapon against the Uyghur population, which we've heard so much about for the last 2 or 3 years, and Iran using it as well. So she goes after 4 official U.S. enemies in very scripted fashion. Let's
Myanmar, China, Ethiopia, Iran.
Let's throw on some of this video if possible. I think it's very, very illuminating and disturbing.
So this is from her hearing in U.S. Congress. Here we go. Put the audio on.
What we saw in Myanmar and are now seeing in Ethiopia are only the opening chapters of a story so terrifying, no one wants to read the end of it.
God.
Congress can change the rules that Facebook plays by and stop the many harms it is now causing. We now know the truth about Facebook's destructive impact. I really appreciate the seriousness which the members of Congress and the Securities and Exchange Commission are approaching these issues. I came forward at great personal risk.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I know, right?
Still have time.
You're probably going to get a fucking book deal after this. You're going to make the rounds on, all these, the CIA news network, MSNBC, maybe even Fox, ABC, NBC, get a TV deal out of it. Maybe no, this definitely benefited you.
It was maybe a risk to her LinkedIn account being looked at, but
yeah,
this is the greatest dream for someone like Frances.
Yeah, becoming a mini celebrity. And to me, this is so revealing, this particular moment. Here is the CNN report, which, again, CIA News Network. That's what we're talking about. The Clinton News Network or the CIA News Network. Here's the headline. Terrifying. They begin with this clickbait. Terrifying. Facebook whistleblower cites violence in Myanmar and Ethiopia, spying by China and Iran. Absolutely incredible. I mean, she didn't. Every country she mentioned is just go down the list of targets and put a check next to every name. It's all of the countries that are targeted by Washington for regime change and destabilization. China, Iran, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Russia. You can go on. And for me, the fact that she mentioned Ethiopia out of all of them is so revealing, because Ethiopia is a new obsession of the Biden administration and the Anthony Blinken State Department. This is a very new development. Of course, there have been hawks in the U.S. government demonizing China and Iran and Russia for decades, and Myanmar for over a year now with the coup and the regime change operation there, trying to reinstall the NED-backed forces in Myanmar. But Ethiopia has become one of the pet projects of the Blinken State Department, and specifically of Samantha Power, the queen of R2P humanitarian intervention over at USAID. So the fact that Haugen mentions Ethiopia specifically is so suspicious, because
she got a talking to by, I don't know, somebody in the State Department. Maybe Blinken sent her an email. Maybe send her a message on WhatsApp before, it went down right before this hearing. This is pretty fucking suspicious, right? Don't you think?
No one in Washington, outside of those little bubbles, no one in Washington is just sitting there thinking about Ethiopia. There are, of course, all these neocons.
Well, no one outside of Washington. No one outside of Washington except Ethiopian diaspora folks.
Yeah. So, and people might be wondering why. I mean, Max and I did an episode about this. Ethiopia has become a major ally of China in Africa. It's the second largest population in Africa. a massively growing economy. Ethiopia signed a peace agreement with its neighbor Eritrea, which has been a target of U.S. regime change operations for many years. They're trying to work together to create this new kind of unified Horn of Africa that is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative in a strategic region. The U.S. is trying to destabilize all of this, try to kick China out of the region, try to prevent rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea and Somalia. And the Biden State Department, I mean, this did not begin with Trump.
Yeah, I just Googled China and Ethiopia. Who is opposing the U.S.-led sanctions on Ethiopia? China.
This was all the Biden administration pushing this. And now we have this so-called Facebook whistleblower who's talking about why we have to censor the social media even more because of Ethiopia. It's so suspicious.
It's just a way of dropping Ethiopia and Myanmar. Nobody talks about Myanmar outside of kind of like spook circles. And as a commenter pointed out, this woman has like the jawline of a spook. Like she just has the vibes of a spook.
What does that mean? Like an Aryan jawline? I don't even
kind of like, you know, she comes out of a Tom Clancy novel and she strikes it.
Yeah, China was the largest.
She'd really been prepared. I mean,
China is the largest foreign investor in Ethiopia during the period of 2000 to 2020. Has a major role in terms of investment and financing the energy sector and the transportation infrastructure, Addis Ababa Airport, roads, railways, seaport terminal, gas pipeline. Flagship project, the Addis Ababa Djibouti Railway connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti City and Djibouti's Dorlech container terminal, inaugurated in 2018, provided landlocked Ethiopia with a good connection between hinterland and the seaport. The economic corridor accounts for more than 95% of Ethiopia's foreign trade. And again, this is just another, example of the U.S.'s new Cold War in China, attacking, these countries who are, partnering and working with China. In this case, Ethiopia has nothing to do with concerns about human rights or democracy or any of that shit. That's just cover for the U.S. empire's interests in trying to, kick China out of the region and harm them and harm anybody that's doing, business with them, right?
I don't know if this is like it's not appropriate to say, but I'm just going to say it. Alex Rubenstein pointed it out that she had lost a lot of weight ahead of this hearing and had really undergone it suggests a process of preparation was underway for this moment. And leaving her aside, this dovetails with a lot of events that we'll talk about, including the Pandora Papers, but also the Facebook outage, which she mentions. But before we get into that, can you throw up the clip of her talking about Uyghurs and Iran? It's also very suggestive.
Another canard, right?
Yeah. So here's a clip. This is what it was at her congressional hearing, and you might have seen
about it.
Yeah, this was going around Twitter.
Notice how Frances Haugen, the supposed Facebook whistleblower, isn't talking about anybody that is ready and willing to do the bidding of the U.S. empire. These other dictatorships, how the United States actually supports 3/4 of the dictatorships in the world. Not throwing any heat at the imperial core here, not throwing any heat at the apartheid regime of Israel, not talking about these egregious actions of U.S. imperialism abroad or any of this stuff. It's all China bad, Iran bad, Ethiopia bad, Myanmar bad.
So this is the so-called Facebook whistleblower Haugen here.
I during my time working with the Threat Intelligence Org, I was a product manager supporting the threat, the counter.
Look at this tweet. Did Facebook also disconnect babies in Kuwait from the
Nash team? My team directly worked on tracking Chinese participation on the platform, surveilling, say, Uyghur populations in places.
Yeah, who is that at the behest of, right? The fucking U.S. empire. That's in support of U.S. imperialism. And again, that the whole fucking Uyghur thing, and just such utter fucking bullshit.
Around the world, that you could actually find the Chinese based on them doing these kinds of things.
So Facebook. Oh, I'm sorry.
We also saw active participation of, say, the Iran government doing espionage on other state actors.
How about, like, she's not here talking about how the DEA during the, Black Lives Matter movement, the protests, that were really hitting a peak during 2020 were being surveilled by the DEA. Maybe not talking about how Facebook maybe helped them with that. Again, like these state actors that she's talking about kind of fits in a very convenient package to support U.S. imperialism, U.S. regime change, and benefiting the U.S. empire, right?
The Iran government.
And I believe Facebook's consistent understaffing of the counter-espionage information operations and
counter-espionage operations. So that's boom. That's like the key there. She thinks, and who again, that's benefiting the U.S. empire. She wants to ramp up counter-espionage operations at Facebook, on the internet, on these social media platforms in general. Pretty fucking problematic.
Counterterrorism teams.
And counterterrorism
is a national security issue.
Issue. And then they pick up on this.
All of this, I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it. This entire hearing, all of this media propaganda, it was all because it was all built around getting that money quote right there. That's the money quote. That's the goal of her testimony. It's the goal of the congressional hearing. Listen to what she said here.
Information operations.
A little bit. Sorry, back more. Here we go. Listen to this quote.
This is definitely a thing that is happening, and I believe Facebook's consistent understaffing of the counter-espionage information operations.
Again, that highlights there the purpose that she is serving to bolster the surveillance state, to bolster U.S. imperialism, to bolster the military-industrial complex.
And counterterrorism teams is a national security issue.
She says Facebook's supposed consistent understaffing of counter-espionage and counterterrorism operations is a national
security. Probably find out later she's funded by the fucking CIA or something.
Security threat to the U.S. government. So, of course, the solution is more censorship, more so-called counter-espionage work, and more so-called counter-terrorism, which is...
And again, all of that shit will be used against people who call out the U.S. empire, call out these regime change efforts, who are critical of capitalism, U.S. imperialism, white supremacy, etc.
This means removing people who criticize U.S. foreign policy, removing people who can be deemed a so-called terrorist threat. I mean, it's blatant political censorship we're talking about, and that's what this is all about. And that's why she singled out Iran and China and Russia and Ethiopia and Myanmar, because they're saying that this is a national security threat. And that's all you have to say in Congress. It's a national security threat, and people turn off their brains and just do whatever you want.
Well, she's also calling for beefing up counter-espionage teams, which means Facebook has counter-espionage teams, and she wants to use Facebook as a espionage device controlled from Langley or Washington,
CIA,
be controlled by the U.S. Hiring spooks, active spooks, to work inside Facebook. That's what she's talking about here. And another point that I think I missed the first time I listened to that clip is she said the Iran government surveilling other state actors, and I actually, glossed over other state actors. Who's she referring to?
Israel.
She's talking about Israel.
Israel.
So this is coming from the Israeli intelligence services. That a comment like that would
and that's exactly what I was thinking when she was speaking, and with all this media coverage. She talks about Iran, China, Russia, Ethiopia, Myanmar. Of course, there's no mention of the well-known Facebook Israeli intelligence operations in Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and Saudi and other U.S. allies. I mean,
and how people who are critical of the apartheid regime in Israel, particularly Palestinians who speak out against that, they are censored probably more than any group on social media, and that's a point that Ben brings up.
The censorship of Palestinians on Facebook is next level. I mean, probably of all the people in the world that are targeted for censorship, I mean, Venezuelans, Chinese, Russians are hit a lot. I know average Venezuelans who have been censored and called supposed state propaganda. It's absurd. But honestly, Palestinians probably face the worst censorship. And there's no acknowledgement whatsoever,
of course,
in this hearing or in any of the media coverage of the Israeli governments, the Israeli apartheid regime's
because it seems like an orchestrated effort to, bolster or increase, the U.S. empire and, their regime change efforts.
Use of Facebook and social media as a weapon.
Yeah. Israeli ministers actually began meeting with Zuckerberg and his staff before the Trump era, before the whole hysteria about fake news, in order to pressure them to censor Palestinian publications. And there was an open door policy, de facto open door policy for them. Of course, this is never talked about. Facebook has responded to this spectacle first by undercutting Haugen's credentials, claiming probably correctly that she was.
Yeah, I'm about to end it though. Let's see. Okay, so that's enough of that. You kind of get the general idea. I think they did a really good job highlighting how problematic this Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen was. Definitely check out the rest of that video. Definitely worth listening to. Like the video, subscribe for more content. Peace, much love.